On an exceptionally hot evening early in July, a young man came out of a garret in which he lodged in S Place and walked slowly, as though in hesitation, towards Cambridge. He had successfully avoided meeting his landlady on the staircase. His garret was under the roof of a high 5-storied house and was more like a cupboard than a room. The landlady, who provided him with garret dinners and attendance, lived on the floor below, and every time he went out, he was obliged to pass her kitchen, the door of which stood invariably open. And each time he passed, the young man had a sick, frightening feeling, which made him scowl and feel ashamed. He was hopelessly in debt to the landlady and was afraid of meeting her. And this was not because he was scared and abject, quite the contrary. But for some part, he had been in overstrained, irritably conditional, verging on hypochondria. He had become so completely absorbed in himself and isolated from his fellows that he dreaded meeting not only his landlady, but anyone at all. He was crushed by poverty, but the anxieties of his position had of late ceased to weigh upon him. He had given up attending to matters of practical importance, and he had lost all desire to do so. Nothing that any landlady could do had a real terror for him, but to be stopped on the chairs, to be forced to listen on her trivial, irrelevant gossip, to pestering demands for payment, threats and complaints, and to rack his brain of excuses to lie. No, rather than that, he would creep down the stairs like a cat and slip out unseen. This evening, however, on coming out from the street, he became acutely aware of his fears. I want to attempt a thing like that, and I'm frightened of these trifles, he thought, with a cold, odd smile. Yes, all is in a man's hand, and he lets it slip from cowardice. That's an axiom. It would be interesting to know what it is men are most afraid of. It would be interesting to know what it is men are most afraid of. Taking a new step, uttering a new word, is that what they do? Is that what they fear the most? But I'm talking too much. It's because I chatter that I do nothing, or perhaps it is that I chatter because I do nothing. I've learned to chatter this last month, lying for days together in my den of Jack the Giant Killer. Why I'm going there now? Am I capable of that? Is that serious? It's not serious at all. It's simply a fantasy to amuse myself. A plaything. Yes, maybe it is a plaything. The heat in the street was terrible, and the airlessness, the bustle and the plaster, scaffolding bricks and dust all about him. And that special Petersburg stench, so familiar to all who are unable to get out of town in summer, all worked painfully upon the young man's already overwrought nerves. The insufferable stench from the pothouses, which are particularly numerous in that part of the town, and drunken men whom he met continually, although it was a working day, completed the revolting misery of the picture. An expression of the profoundest disgust gleamed from a moment in the young man's refined face. He was, by the way, exceptionally handsome, above the average in height, slim, well built, with beautifully dark eyes and dark brown hair. Soon, he sank into deep thought, or more accurately speaking, into a complete blankness of mind. He walked, he walked along, not observing what was about him and not caring to observe it. From time to time, he would mutter something from the habit of talking to himself, to which he had just confessed moments ago. At these moments, he would become conscious that his ideas were sometimes in a tangle and that he was very weak. For 2 days, he had scarcely tasted food. He was so badly dressed that even a man accustomed to shabbiness would have been ashamed to be seen in the street in such rags. In that quarter of the town, however, scarcely any shortcoming in dress would create surprise. Owing to the proximity of the Haymarket, the number of establishments of bad character, and the preponderance of the trade and working class population crowded in these streets and alleys in the heart of Petersburg, types so various were to be seen in the streets that no figure, however queer, would have caused surprise. But there was such accumulated bitterness and contempt in the young man's heart that, in spite of all the fastidiousness of youth, he minded his rags least of all in the street. It was a different matter when he met with his acquaintances or with former fellow students whom indeed he disliked meeting at the time. And yet, when a drunken man who, for some unknown reason, was being taken somewhere in a huge wagon dragged by a heavy dray horse, suddenly shouted at him as he drove past, "Hey there, German hatter!" bawling at the top of his voice and pointing at him. The young man stopped suddenly and clutched tremulously at his hat. It was a tall hat from Zimmerman's, but completely worn out, rusty with age, all torn and bespattered, brimless and bent on one side in a most unseeming fashion. Not shame, however, but quite another feeling, akin to terror, had overtaken him. "I knew it," he muttered in confusion. "I thought so. That's the worst of all. Why, stupid things like this, the most trivial detail, might spoil the whole plan. Yes, my hat is too noticeable. It looks absurd, and that makes it noticeable. With my rags, I ought to wear a cap. Any sort of old pancake, but not this grotesque thing. Nobody wears such a hat. It would be noticed a mile off. It would be remembered. What matters is that people would remember it, and that would give them a clue. For this business, one should be as little conspicuous as possible. Trifles are what matters. Why, it's such trifles that always ruins everything." He had not far to go. He knew exactly how many steps it was from the gate of his lodging house, exactly 730. He had counted them once when he had been lost in dreams, and at the time he had put no faith in those dreams and was only tantalizing himself by their hideousness, but daring reckless. Now, a month later, he had begun to look upon them differently, and in spite of the monologues in which he jeered at his own impotence and indecision, he had involuntarily come to regard this hideous dream as an exploit to be attempted. Although he still did not realize this himself, he was positively going now for a rehearsal of his project, and at every step his excitement grew more and more violent. With a sinking heart and a nervous tremor, he went up to a huge house which on one side looked onto the canal and on the other side into the street. This house was let out in tiny tenements and was inhabited by working people of all kinds, tailors and locksmiths, cooks, Germans of sorts, girls picking up a living as best they could, petty clerks, etc. There was a continual coming and going through the two gates and in the two courtyards of the house. 3 or 4 doorkeepers were employed on the building. The young man was very glad to meet none of them, and once slipped unnoticed through the door on the right and up the staircase. There was a back staircase, dark and narrow, but he was familiar with it already and knew his way. And liked all the surroundings in such darkness, even the most inquisitive eyes were not to be dreaded. If I am so scared now, what would happen if someone came to pass that I was really going to do it? He could not help asking himself as he reached the fourth story. There, his progress was barred by some porters who were engaged in moving furniture out of a flat. He knew that the flat had been occupied by a German clerk in the civil service and his family. This German was moving out then, and so the fourth floor on this staircase would be untenanted, except by the old woman. That's a thing anyway, he thought of himself as he rang the bell of the old woman's flat. The bell gave a faint tinkle as though it were made of tin and not copper. Little flats in such houses always have bells that ring like that. He had forgotten the note of that bell, and now its peculiar tingle seemed to remind him of something, and to bring it clearly before him, he started. His nerves were terribly overstrained by now. In a little while, the door opened, a tiny crack. The old woman eyed her visitor with evident distrust through the crack, and nothing could be seen but her little eyes, glittering in the darkness. But seeing a number of people on the landing, she grew bolder and opened the door wide. The young man stepped into the dark entry, which was partitioned off from the tiny kitchen. The old woman stood facing him in silence and looked inquiringly at him. She was a diminutive, withered up old woman of 60 with large, malignant eyes and a little sharp nose. Her colorless, somewhat grizzled hair was thickly smeared with oil and wore no handkerchief over it. Round her thin, long neck, which looked like a hen's leg, was knotted with some sort of flannel rag, and in spite of the heat, they hung flapping on her shoulders, a mangy fur cape, yellow with age. The old woman coughed and groaned at every instant. The young man must have looked at her with a rather peculiar expression, for a gleam of mistrust came from her eyes again. Raskolnikov, a student. I came here a month ago. The young man made haste to mutter, with half a bow, remembering that he ought to be more polite. I remember, my good sir, I remember quite well your coming here, the old woman said distinctly, still keeping her inquiring eyes on his face. And here I am on the same errand again, Raskolnikov continued, a little disconcerted and surprised at the old woman's mistrust. Perhaps she's always like that. Only I did not notice it the other time, he thought with an uneasy feeling. The old woman paused as though hesitating, then stepped on one side and pointing on the door of the room, she said, letting her visitor pass in front of her, "Step in, my good sir." The little room which the young man walked with yellow papers on the walls, geraniums and muslin contains in the world, was brightly lighted up the moment by the setting sun. So the sun will shine like then, flashed as it were by the chance through Raskolnikov's mind, and with a rapid glance he scanned everything in the room, trying as far as possible to notice and remember its arrangement. But there was nothing special in the room. The furniture, all very old of the yellow wood, consisted of a sofa, which was huge, bent wooden back, an oval table in front of the sofa, a dressing table with a looking glass fixed on it between the windows, chairs along the walls, and two or three halfpenny prints in yellow frames representing German damsels with birds in their hands. That was all. In the corner, a light was burning before a small icon. Everything was very clean. The floor and the furniture were brightly polished. Everything shone. Lizaveta's work, thought the young man. There was not a speck of dust to be seen in the whole flat. The houses of spiteful old widows that one finds such cleanliness, Raskolnikov thought again, and he stole a curious glance at the cotton curtain over the door leading into another tiny room, in which the old woman's bed stood and a chest of drawers, which he had never looked into before. These two rooms made up the whole flat. "What do you want?" the old woman said, coming into the room, standing in front of him so as to look him straight in the face. "I've brought something to pawn here." And he drew out his pocket an old-fashioned flat silver watch, and on the back of which was engraved a globe. The chain was of steel. "But the time is for your last pledge. The month was up the day before yesterday. I will bring you the interest for another month. Wait a little." "But that's for me, as I do, I please, my good sir, to wait or to sell your pledge at once." "How much will you give me for the watch, Alyona Ivanova?" "You come with such trifles, my good sir, it's scarcely worth anything. I gave you 2 rubles last time for your ring, and one could buy it quite new at a jeweller's for 1.50 rubles. Give me 4 rubles for it. I shall redeem it. It was my father's. I shall be getting some money soon." 1.50 rubles? An interest in advance, if you like. 1.50 rubles? Cried the young man. "Please," said the old woman, handed him back the watch. The young man took it and was so angry that he was on the point of going away, but checked himself at once, remembering that there was nowhere else he could go, and that he had another object also in the coming. "Hand it over," he said roughly. The old woman fumbled in her pocket for her keys and disappeared between the curtain into the other room. The young man, left standing alone in the middle of the room, listened inquisitively, thinking. He could hear her unlocking the chest of drawers. "It must be the top drawer," he reflected. "So she carries the keys in a pocket on the right, all in the bunch on a steel ring. And there's one key there, 3 times as big as all of the others, which deep notches. And that can be the key of the chest of drawers. Then there must be some other chest or strong box. That's worth knowing. Strong boxes always have keys like that, but somehow degrading it all is." The old woman came back. "Here, sir. As we say, 10 kopecks, that ruble a month. So I must take 15 kopecks from 1.50 rubles from the month in advance. But for 2 rubles I lent you before, you owe me now 20 kopecks on the same reckoning in advance. That makes 35 kopecks altogether. So I must give you 1.15 rubles kopecks for the watch. Here it is." "What? Only 1.15 rubles kopecks now?" "Just so." The young man did not dispute it and took the money. He looked at the old woman, and he was in no hurry to get away, as though there was something he wanted to say or to do, but he did not himself quite know that. "I may be bringing you something else in a day or two, Alyona. A valuable thing, silver, a cigarette box, as soon as I get it from a friend." "Well, we will talk about it then, sir." Goodbye. And as you're always home alone, is your sister with you? He asked her as casually as possible as he went into the passage. What business is she of yours, my good sir? Oh, nothing particular. I simply asked. You're too quick. Good day, Alyona. Raskolnikov went out in complete confusion. This confusion became more and more intense. As he went down the stairs, he even stopped 2 or 3 times as though suddenly struck by some thought. When he was in the street, he cried out, "Oh God, how loathsome it all is! And can I possibly? No, it's nonsense. It's rubbish." He absolutely added, "And how could such an atrocious thing come into my head? What filthy things my heart is capable of!" Yes, filth of all, disgusting, loathsome. For a whole month I've been, but no words, no explanations could express his agitation, the feeling of intense repulsion, which he had begun to oppress and torture his heart while he was on his way to the old woman, had by now reached such a pitch that he had taken such a definite form that he did not know what to do with himself to make such an escape of the wretchedness. He walked along the pavement like a drunken man, regardless of the passerbys and jostling against them, and only came to his senses when he was in the next street. Looking around, he noticed that he was standing close to a tavern. Which, when entered, leads to a pavement to the basement. At that instant, 2 drunken men came out of the door and, abusing and supporting one another, they mounted the steps. Without stopping to think, Raskolnikov went down the steps at once. Till that moment, he had never been into a tavern. But now he felt giddy and was tormented by a burning thirst. He longed for a drink of cold beer and attributed his sudden weakness to the want of food. He sat down at a sticky little table in a dark, dirty corner, ordered some beef, and drank eagerly of the first glassful. At once he felt easier and his thought became clear. All that's nonsense, as there is nothing in it to worry about at all. It's simply physical derangement. Just a glass of beer, a piece of dry bread, and in one moment the brain is stronger, the mind is clearer, the will is firm. Phew, how petty it is. But in spite of this scornful reflection, he was now looking cheerful, as though he had been suddenly set free from a terrible burden. And he gazed around in a friendly way at the people in the room. And even though in the moment he had a dim foreboding, the mind frame became happier. And that was not normal to him. There were few people at the time in the tavern besides the 2 drunken men he had met on the steps. A group consisting of about 5 men and a girl with a concertina had gone out at the same time. The departure left the room quiet and rather empty. The persons still in the tavern were a man who appeared to be an artisan, drunk, but not extremely so, sitting before a pot of beer, and his companion, a huge, stout man with a grey beard and a short, full-skirted coat. He was very drunk and had dropped asleep on the bench every now and then. He began, as though in his sleep, cracking his fingers with his arms wide apart and the upper part of his body bounding about on the bench while he hummed some meaningless refrain, trying to recall some such lines as this. His wife a year he fondly loved, his wife a year he fondly loved. Walking along the crowded row, he met the one he used to know. But no one shared his enjoyment. His silent companion looked with positive hostility and mistrust at all these manifestations. There was another man in the room who looked somewhat like a retired government clerk. He was sitting apart, now and then sipping from his pot and looking around at the company. He too appeared to be in some agitation.